when stability became the most dangerous illusion. Everything looked calm on the surface. Markets were steady, institutions functioned, and leaders spoke of balance. But stability can hide danger better than chaos ever could. This story matters today because societies often mistake the absence of crisis for health, believing that if nothing is breaking, nothing needs fixing. History shows the opposite, that the most fragile systems are often the ones that appear most stable. The absence of visible failure is not evidence of resilience. It can be evidence of suppression, of problems being deferred rather than resolved, of flexibility being sacrificed in exchange for the appearance of control. At the time, the country had emerged from years of disruption and uncertainty, leaving people desperate for predictability and relief. Order felt like progress, and calm was celebrated as success. The psychological need for stability after prolonged instability was so powerful that it shaped not just public sentiment, but institutional behavior. Every decision was evaluated through the lens of whether it preserved calm, and any action that might disrupt the appearance of normalcy was avoided regardless of its long-term merit. Leaders reinforced this belief, pointing to steady growth, functioning governance, and declining unrest as proof that the system worked. Questioning stability was framed as irresponsible, even dangerous. The framing was effective because it aligned with the public's emotional state. People who had lived through disruption were predisposed to interpret stability as achievement, and to view those who questioned it as threats to the peace they had worked so hard to restore. What few acknowledged was how tightly that stability was being maintained. Flexibility diminished, dissent narrowed, and adaptation slowed in the name of preserving balance. The mechanisms that maintained stability were increasingly brittle rather than robust. Stability maintained through rigidity is fundamentally different from stability maintained through adaptability, though both look identical from the surface. Policies focus on preventing disruption rather than preparing for change. Institutions became guardians of the present instead of builders of the future. The institutional orientation shifted from forward-looking to defensive. Resources that might have been invested in adaptation were instead devoted to maintaining current arrangements, creating a growing gap between the system's capacity and the demands that the future would eventually place on it. At first, this approach delivered reassurance. Nothing collapsed, nothing exploded, and nothing demanded urgent attention. The short-term results validated the approach and reinforced the belief that stability was both the goal and the evidence of good governance. But stability was becoming brittle. And brittle systems break, suddenly, not gradually. As time passed, the cost of preserving stability began to surface, not through crisis, but through constraint. Innovation slowed as risk was discouraged, leaving systems efficient but unprepared for change. The aversion to disruption extended beyond political governance into economic and social domains. Entrepreneurship, experimentation, and creative destruction, the processes through which systems renew themselves, were all dampened by an environment that prioritized predictability over adaptation. Decision-making favored short-term balance over long-term resilience, reinforcing habits that avoided disruption at any cost. The time horizon of governance contracted. Decisions were evaluated by their immediate impact on stability, rather than by their contribution to long-term capacity. This temporal compression meant that investments in future resilience were consistently deferred in favor of actions that maintained present calm. Public frustration grew quietly. As opportunity narrowed and adaptation felt increasingly difficult. The constraint was not dramatic enough to trigger protest, but it was persistent enough to erode satisfaction. Citizens experienced a growing gap between the system's promises and their lived reality, a gap that the narrative of stability could paper over but not resolve. Leaders continued to defend the system, arguing that stability required discipline and sacrifice. The rhetoric of sacrifice served a dual purpose. It acknowledged that conditions were imperfect, while attributing those imperfections to the necessary cost of maintaining order. This framing made dissatisfaction itself seem like evidence of the population's insufficient commitment to stability. Warnings were dismissed as alarmist because nothing was visibly wrong. The absence of crisis became the primary evidence against the need for change, creating a circular logic in which the very success of stability, in preventing visible failure, was used to argue that the system needed no modification. Institutions optimized for preservation rather than response, leaving little room for flexibility. The institutional architecture that had been built to maintain stability was poorly suited to respond to novel challenges. Systems designed to prevent disruption could not pivot to address disruption when it eventually arrived from directions they had not anticipated. The system appeared strong, but it was losing its ability to bend. Stability had become an objective, not a condition, and objectives can be defended long after they stop serving people. The conflict emerged when external pressure finally tested the system, revealing how little adaptability remained beneath its calm surface. Economic shifts, technological change, and social demands exposed weaknesses that stability had concealed rather than resolved. The challenges that arrived were not the challenges the system had been designed to prevent. They were new, unfamiliar, and required precisely the kind of flexible response that the stability-oriented system had been built to avoid. Each attempt to respond was slowed by rules designed to prevent disruption, turning flexibility into a liability instead of a strength. The regulatory and procedural framework that had served to maintain stability now functioned as an impediment to the rapid adaptation that the situation demanded. Public trust eroded as people sensed that order was being protected more fiercely than progress. The realization that institutional priorities had diverged from public needs produced a crisis of legitimacy that was more dangerous than the external pressures themselves. The buildup intensified when a major shock required rapid adjustment, something the system was structurally unable to deliver. What once felt reliable now felt rigid, as mechanisms built to preserve balance resisted necessary change. Stability was no longer maintaining peace. It was blocking solutions. The illusion began to crack, not because chaos arrived, but because adaptation failed. This was the moment when calm revealed itself as fragility. And fragility under pressure does not hold. The climax arrived when stability finally collapsed under pressure had been avoiding for years. What appeared solid gave way quickly, revealing how much strength had been sacrificed to preserve calm. The resolution lies in understanding that stability without adaptability is not safety, but delay. Systems survive not by remaining unchanged, but by evolving before crisis forces it. This story matters today, because many societies continue to defend stability as an end rather than a tool. History shows that resilience comes from flexibility, not stillness. Order can be comforting, but comfort should never replace preparedness. The illusion of stability is powerful because it hides urgency until it is too late. The most important question any society can ask itself is not whether its systems are stable, but whether its stability would survive a test it has not yet imagined. The answer to that question determines whether calm is a sign of health or a symptom of denial. Subscribe to join the journey.